Hello, everyone. This is Love Bat, and I'm coming here after just seeing the screening of Star Wars The Force Awakens, or Star Wars Episode 7. However, you want to word that, this is going to be a spoilerific review, or sort of, I don't know if I even want to call it a rant, but I'm going to give my thoughts on it. Am, you could say that I'm fairly let down from what I watched as a Star Wars fan. I mean, especially since I was celebrating this kind of for my birthday because I really wanted to see Star Wars, and I'm a huge Star Wars fan. However, there were a lot of things that really irked me about this movie when I decided to watch it. And I decided to go ahead and wait on it a little bit and see, wait on the hype a little bit. I didn't want to get on the hype train right away, and I didn't want to go ahead and just see it just because it's Star Wars, because I've already know how bad the prequels were, or how disappointing they ended up being for a number of people, including myself in a sense, and those that wanted something on the quality of the original movies. And so I just wanted to go ahead and wait for the hype to die down just a little bit, then see it for myself and just formulate my own thoughts on it without knowing anything much about it going into it, other than just who like the actors were cast as and the reprising characters, like Harrison Ford and Mark Hamill and Carrie Fisher from the original trilogy. Now, all that being said, there are going to be major spoilers. I might talk about some of the expanded universe a little bit and my thoughts because I have played various games, Star Wars games, and I've not really read too many books or anything like that. I mean, I might have read a little bit here and there, but it's not much that I remember much of. There's probably some other people that are more educated about some of the expanded universe elements than I am. But then again, as people know, Disney kind of trashed the expanded universe content already and kind of just deemed it all invalid. And this film pretty much cements that. So if you don't want to go ahead and hear about a little bit of the expanded universe and maybe a game or here and there, then you will not want to watch this review. There might be some spoilers here and there. But I'll try and give you a warning if you want to try and skip over some stuff. Now, the bulk of my complaints come from a few things. One is continuity with the original trilogy, even if you don't have the prequels in it much at all. Just with the original trilogy, just the continuity is just, it's not quite there for me, to be honest. The second thing is that just things happen for seemingly no reason or just not explained. I mean, the in-universe explanations of how Star Wars works are just kind of disregarded, or things happen for no reason, or characters will do things that might not even be in their character that we just saw from older movies, maybe, or just anything that happens in the Star Wars universe. Another thing that would also probably irk me a lot is just how the characters are handled. Even if they're properly cast, the script really needed an editor. I will kid you not, the script could use a lot of work for this movie, and that is both in the pacing, setting things up, the build up, and just how it was directed by J.J. Abrams. And people are calling him Jar Jar Abrams already. I mean, that's not exactly inaccurate, because with the way that this movie was done, it was done for, well, money. That's the way that this film was done after I saw it. They disregarded a lot of things that would have made sense or would have been a lot better to do, and they just went their own way, thinking that Disney, they knew better. JJ, he'll go ahead and do what we need him to do, and that's make us money. That's basically what happened here. Now, another thing that I want to go ahead and get to outside just, continuity and, the plot errors and, things like that. I mean, there are some different goofs that happen during the movie, just, like technical stuff and, even some things that are just scientifically speaking just kind of bizarre if you look at it. I mean, you probably won't notice it while you're watching the movie because you really want to enjoy it. I'm a Star Wars fan. I wanted to enjoy this movie a lot. However, there is just, I mean, I'm not feeling it. It didn't have that classic Star Wars feeling that I had when I watched those original movies on VHS at my old house, back when I was just a kid, and it was magical. You didn't need midi-chlorians to explain the Force like the prequels did, and you also didn't need like these lame excuses for how someone has, say, like with Han and Leia, you have, the expanded universe, they have kids. I mean, people were hoping that it might be kind of based on the expanded universe. It wasn't, but just a lame excuse. Well, in this case, it would be Kylo Ren turning to the dark side of the Force with no explanations for anything. they needed to explain things a lot better. Even with a 2 hour movie or 2.5 hours or however the heck long it was, they didn't explain anything at all. There was so much action. There was hardly even any lightsaber fights in this movie. There was, what, one, two, maybe two actual lightsaber battles in the entire movie. And that's even including stuff that you might have seen in the previous movies, like, deflecting blaster bolts from troopers, or, using your lightsaber in training, or using it as a tool to cut stuff open, or, using it just for, defensive purposes to thwart something off, or, whatever the case may be. The only time that we ever really see a lightsaber used at all outside of the context of the battles, for what little there are, is when Kylo Ren, which is sort of like the main antagonist of this movie, a Dark Jedi, is just going on sort of a, hissy fit whenever something doesn't go his way, and he starts just slicing and dicing things at random, which, isn't very practical. I never saw Vader do that. He usually just chokes someone to death for being incompetent. So, I mean, there's that, and we don't even see training. We don't see any Jedi training whatsoever. We don't see development. We don't see development of characters. We don't see development of the story going on from episode 6 afterwards. And, filling the time in between is just assumed that the audience just somehow knows what happens, or that we have to just take what they say in the movie at face value. Like, that's obviously what happened, and we don't have to explain it. Man, it's just very disappointing that it's just the continuity would not have held up as well, or it could have held up better. But if you do not have the Star Wars name attached to this movie, it would seem like a very cheap copy of Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope, because that's essentially how the plot lines up for this movie. Everything from the droid, BB-88 or whatever his name was, all the way out to Rey, which is like the main protagonist of this movie, is just everything is a big copy of Episode 4. That's a big, big, big no-no if you're just copying a movie that was already in the series. And it's also pretty interesting that, there's I don't want to try and call it pandering, but it's not a problem, but it is a problem if there's really no real reason for the way things happen. Like trying to make some characters seem stronger than the others, like, Rey is like a strong female protagonist. She kind of fits in that mold, and, it could have been really good for her, but they just made her so damn OP, as one might call it, so powerful to try and make it seem like she's better than everyone else, and it just comes off as cheap. And he doesn't need to know all this stuff like right off the bat. It took like Luke, it took him over the course of a few movies to get to where he was during Return of the Jedi. But with the way that Rey knows all this stuff like right off the bat, considering her background and way that she's grown up as a scavenger, you would expect her to not just know all this stuff the way that she does. But I've heard that people call her a bit of a Mary Sue, and that doesn't sound inaccurate, because you can't just know everything for no reason at all, with no explanation, no foreshadowing given as to what may have led to her knowing all this stuff, whether it be technical knowledge or piloting or these other things that come up later in the movie, which I'll get to in a bit. There's even just some parts where they just copy off of different things, like, again, lots of aspects of the movie are basically just recycled from episode 4. It's very unoriginal. From the beginning to the end, the ending is basically almost like episode 4, except episode 7 does not end with answering questions. It does not end with a definite ending that can stand on its own. You have to watch the next two movies to actually get the answers you're looking for coming into watching this. That is just it's just ridiculous. It really is. Especially when even the opening scene involving Rey, which is, supposed to be, made out to be this female protagonist type deal, and she's going to be, it's very much hinted that once you can tell that it's copying episode 4, that she's going to be following sort of in the Jedi footsteps, or if you've even seen any promotional material at all, it's already hinted at, and you can kind of already tell that's going to happen. But it just copies off of even Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind. That first opening scene with Rey, which you can also see in the trailers for the movie, it is so eerily similar to the opening scene from Nausicaa, which also features a lead female protagonist. And there's just so much copying and so much ripping off There's no originality to this film at all, and there's nothing. I mean, there were a few good points. Obviously, there's a few good points. I mean, there's a few quotes by Han Solo that are pretty good. Han Solo obviously shows up in this movie, and there was also a part in the movie like where you have like a little, you always have that cantina type scene. I mean, there's a character there that was kind of decent, I guess. I mean, I don't know. They're not exactly memorable. There aren't really any memorable new characters other than Ray, which I thought was well casted. But the script just wasn't doing anything for me at all. And another thing that really bothered me about this movie is that if you go through the film and you just watch it, you just watch it all the way through. Watch it again. Maybe if it goes out on DVD and Blu-ray, just watch it again with an open mind. Don't go into it with the hype or anything like that. Just watch through it, rewind it, maybe watch it again. The first big thing that really irks me is the very, very beginning of the film. And if I'm just talking about the thing that just caught my eye that made me feel wary about watching it was the opening title sequence. The opening title sequence of this movie basically hinted or implied that Leia was not Jedi at all. She wasn't Force sensitive. It just didn't really make her out to be anything other than a general, which is kind of what Han was in Episode 6, where he's leading troops. And, he's had the Millennium Falcon. He gave it to Lando, but it kind of made her out to be just kind of like Han, except for the fact that she can have Jedi children, I guess, because she's a Skywalker technically. But apparently all that build up in Episode 5 and Episode 6, where Yoda's like, there is another Skywalker. Leia is going to be important because she's the one person. The one person. Even Luke tells her this in Episode 6, that she is the one person that can save the Rebel Alliance should anything ever happen to Luke, which is basically what happens at the beginning of Episode 7, is that, Luke's gone away, he's in seclusion, he's hidden away somewhere, he's ran away because he wants to try and find some Jedi temple or something like that. And so we have Leia here that just, apparently she's not a Jedi. I don't know why, it's never really explained. The only thing that happens is that she says, well, I just went back to doing what I do best. A single line you can't do away without explaining what happened for like 20 or 30 years. I mean, were you not training with Luke at the Jedi, the new Jedi Order, or the, Jedi training? Or, I mean, that's expanded universe stuff as well, because apparently in the expanded universe, Leia is a Jedi. Luke turns to the dark side, and Leia is supposed to be the one that brings him back to the light side, because that's why it was so heavily built up in Episode 5 and 6 that she's Force sensitive. Clearly she can use the Force. She can sense Luke's presence. She can go ahead and do these things. She can develop her Force powers if she trains at it. I mean, what was happening for those 20 years where she just decided she didn't want to do that anymore? It does not make sense. And speaking of Jedi training, or the lack thereof, apparently this Rey character can pick things up so fast and has so much knowledge of being just a scavenger that is kind of mind-boggling, just how much someone can know with just being in the same kind of position that Anakin was when he was just, a little boy, just was working in Watto's shop, or, Luke Skywalker, who's, kind of a farm boy and all that, and he's had some experience piloting things and stuff like that, and he's wanting to go to the academy and all that kind of stuff. But none of this stuff comes just immediate to him or immediate to anybody else in those movies, so to speak. It doesn't happen the same way that happens with Rey in this movie, where if something comes up, she just suddenly knows how to, fix it, or she suddenly knows how to get things done, or solve the problem, or, taking care of business and all that. And then in Episode 4, Luke gets some training from Obi-Wan on the Millennium Falcon and such. And then in Episode 5, he gets trained by Yoda. This builds up. This is obviously over Episode 4 and Episode 5, from the part where Ben or Obi-Wan starts training Luke, all the way up to the point to where he trains briefly with Yoda. You would have to think that's at least like 1 to 2 years of time spent honing your Force powers, learning how to use a lightsaber, and using the different parts of the Force and learning about it by actually doing it. Meanwhile, we have Rey, which, she's clearly not a weak character by any means. But later on in the movie, she ends up fighting the main antagonist, Kylo Ren. So essentially, just what builds up is absolutely nothing, for one. And for two, it makes no sense that someone with absolutely no training can go ahead and fight a dark Jedi who's been trained in both the light and the dark side by Luke, and then the main sort of Sith Lord of the film, which is Snoke, I believe, is what his name was. And so Kylo Ren can just basically not win against someone who is, not been trained in any Jedi kind of way. Apparently, someone who knows how to use a Jedi mind trick and force pull of the lightsaber to try and, draw it to them. Someone that has no training in, how to do any of these things, but apparently they can do all that in using force powers, and then they can defeat someone in a one-on-one lightsaber duel. Someone like Kylo Ren. There is no way that anyone would be able to go ahead and do that without at least a few years of training. And not to mention, that was the first time that Rey had ever used a lightsaber. Even for those that are force sensitive, it does take a bit of time to be able to pick things up properly. Even the first time that Luke ever used a lightsaber, which was when Obi-Wan was training him on the Millennium Falcon with that remote, he was clumsy. And you need to be able to tell your opponent's movements to be able to win against another Jedi. You can't telegraph your moves, especially if you're going to try and defeat someone and hit them. There's no way you would be able to go ahead and beat someone that was not only trained by Luke, but they were also trained in the dark side, and they stopped a blaster bolt dead in its tracks early in the movie without a second thought, stopping it in midair like it was nothing. And it was like, not even Darth Vader did that in the original movies, and he was damn powerful. And apparently Kylo Ren isn't even as powerful as Darth Vader was, because he's still training. At the end of the movie, it's implied that he still has more training to go. And Darth Vader was a Sith Lord, but, Kylo Ren, he can stop a blaster dead in its tracks. He can cut up anything he wanted with a lightsaber. He's using a badass saber, or a badass looking one, even if it's not, even if it's not looking practical. I mean, if you have training with something that's an exotic blade like that, you expect them to know how to use it and not lose to an amateur at best. Rey has absolutely no training whatsoever in wielding or using a lightsaber, and yet she can still go ahead and beat Kylo Ren in one-on-one combat, who is a really well-trained Jedi. And that's on top of already knowing how to use the Jedi mind trick or force pull, even having no Jedi training before and not having any knowledge of those force powers. Not only that, but Finn, which is kind of the secondary main character who does not appear to be force sensitive, can actually use a lightsaber in combat against other people who have training with those melee weapons that they used against him. First, he ends up fighting a stormtrooper who's using, I guess, I'm not sure if it's like a vibro blade type thing or if it's some excess kind of technology, kind of like what we saw in episode 3 when those kind of, those bodyguards are fighting, like Anakin and Obi-Wan or whatever. I'm not sure what that was, but apparently there's some sorts of melee technology which can deal with lightsabers if you're not a Jedi. So apparently Finn, as he's called, the sort of stormtrooper turned to the Rebel Alliance. I mean, they're called they're called something else in this movie. Technically, they're called the Resistance, but they still might as well just be the same old Rebel Alliance that they always were. I mean, they're using X-wings. They have pilots that are shown in sort of the same manner or similar manner as they do in like all the other Star Wars movies or in other movies that feature airplanes like Top Gun or whatever. And so it's not really anything like what you would really expect. At least not with this character anyway, not being force sensitive and not having Jedi training, but being able to use a lightsaber even after in the original trilogy, Han Solo was the only non-Jedi to ever use a lightsaber. And that was just as a tool to cut open a tauntaun to go ahead and keep Luke warm because he got hurt. So anyone being able to use a lightsaber without the training at all, even when it's implied in the books and the expanded universe that someone without training, they would be likely to unintentionally injure themselves as well as others around them, because of the fact that they wouldn't know how to use the blade because it's like a weightless blade, I think is what it's supposed to be, because that's why the laser sword, I mean, it's so powerful, but you can move it so fast. It's not like a sword where it's metal and it's like, clumsy, where you have to go ahead and carry the weight around and then you have to push it in as hard as you can to sort of stab them and to try and cut through the armor or to pierce through the skin so that way you can go ahead and wound them and kill them and whatever. And you don't have to worry about any of that. So without training, you would probably end up severely injuring yourself, if not maybe, cutting off your arm or really doing some serious damage if you didn't have training with a blade like that. I mean, someone that isn't force sensitive probably could learn how to use it, but it would require years of use to be able to try and actually master it or to be able to be competent at it, especially against someone else that actually knows what the heck they're doing and isn't going to hurt themselves flinging around a blade that could cut your arm off with one bad move. And if that weren't enough, then you also have a point where not only does Finn fight a stormtrooper with a lightsaber, but he also fights Kylo Ren, the Dark Jedi, with the lightsaber, and apparently he's able to go ahead and slightly wound him and get a hit off on him, despite not being force sensitive, despite only having used the lightsaber once, even if he's not force sensitive and has no training prior to using it that one time either, which didn't make any sense to begin with. But apparently after using the lightsaber one time and basically coming out at a stalemate with this stormtrooper, apparently he knows enough about using a lightsaber to go toe to toe and, fight a Dark Jedi, not being a Jedi himself, which is just ludicrous. I mean, we all saw what happens when someone tries to go against a Jedi that isn't a Jedi, and you are not very prepared or equipped to be able to deal with them. I mean, we've seen what happens when you try and go at a Jedi with a blaster. Apparently, if you go ahead and catch him off guard or surprise, you can go ahead and hit him with one, but it takes more than one hit to take him down, as we saw in the movie when Chewie uses his bowcaster to go ahead and wound Kylo Ren. I mean, maybe that's the reason why they could make it to where, oh, he's losing the battle because he's wounded and he's having to, pat himself in the ribs or whatever to try and take away the pain. But even then, he uses force powers to go ahead and sort of stun or freeze Rey, which is the female protagonist, and he just froze her in place at one point in the movie. And it was easy. He didn't have to think much about it. He was just, okay, I'm a badass. I'm going to freeze you in place, and you're not going to move a single step. All he had to do was do that for a few seconds, and then slice her in half, and then she's gone. She's a goner. There's no way that she could have won that fight. Especially, even if she does have a lightsaber, there's no way that she was going to be able to win. I mean, it would have been like someone who was just like a squire in medieval times fighting a fully fledged knight that has seen combat, has had extensive training, and knows his blade, and he is just so much better than this other person, and somehow they end up losing, and then some sort of weird plot device that's like a big Deus Ex Machina pops out of nowhere when an earthquake just forms between Rey and this Kylo Ren. At the end of their fight, they don't get to actually have a conclusion. It's a lame fight, by the way. There's hardly any swordplay. It's just a bunch of, struggling around, a few swings here and there. Somehow she ends up gaining the upper hand because he's wounded from getting hit by Chewbacca's bowcaster. And it's just... and if you're wondering the context of how Chewbacca got a shot in on him, it's because it's revealed earlier in the movie that Kylo is actually Han and Leia's son, or sort of like a long lost, son to the dark side. And then later on, Kylo ends up, having a confrontation with Han and, making it look like, oh, I'm struggling. I don't know if I have the strength to turn to the light side. And he ends up killing Han. He ends up killing Han, and what seems to... they've tried to make out to be an emotional confrontation. He ends up killing Han just point blank, and then Chewie ends up somehow able to get in a shot with his crossbow while apparently, Kylo is distracted from distress and, facing his dad and just taking him down, then tossing him down into the dark abyss after he's, plunged him with his saber. And I mean, in the grand scheme of things, a plot device like that might be expected. I mean, we saw that in Empire Strikes Back, but, there's really no build-up. There wasn't any suspense, because Kylo had already revealed his face, because he has a mask, kind of like Darth Vader had, and he has a different sort of sounding bass voice behind the mask and everything, so it creates some mysteriousness as to who he could be. But then earlier in the film, it's revealed that he is Han and Leia's son, who apparently trained with Luke and did all that stuff at the Jedi Academy, and he killed everyone that was there because he got turned to the dark side of the Force somehow by this other Sith Lord that kind of like the Emperor and Darth Vader. But nothing is really explained. But getting a bit back on track here with Kylo Ren and Han. Han to me just got killed in kind of a cheap and almost anticlimactic way because of how it just felt like it just didn't have any sorts of build up to it like you would have thought between like a father and son. And you could just kind of see it coming after you already saw all the steps that were taken and everything it led up to just playing out a lot like episode 4 did. You try and have an emotional build up, but you can tell he's going to die. I mean, we all know that if Kylo doesn't if he turns to the light side right then and there and becomes a good guy, then what the heck is the other two films going to be about? I mean, there has to be a bad guy. There has to be sort of a Sith apprentice. There has to be a pawn that goes around doing the bidding of the big Sith Lord and all that. Because what else are you going to do for two other movies? I mean, we all know that when Han was walking on that platform towards what he knew was his son, apparently. I mean, he apparently knew all this stuff that he had this mask. He knew what he was up to. He knew all this stuff, and it was told throughout the story that they knew that their son, Han and Leia, knew that their son had turned to the dark side, and apparently it's not explained how that happened. It just did, and he hates his dad, and he doesn't like thinking about the light side. Kylo is it's a cheap villain tactic to where they try and create some way of making him evil for the sake of him being evil, even though all his actions just earlier in the movie they try and make him evil, and he's just maybe not whiny, but he's totally emotional, and he's struggling so much for Sith. I mean, again, he's not fully trained, but again, lots of things do not make sense when put together as the whole. Some things individually would be acceptable. On the whole, they are not acceptable because Han and Leia having a dark side Jedi son, not out of the question. But that combined with everything else is it does not make sense at all, and there's no build up, no suspense. Things are revealed way too early with no build up. There's no character development of any of the new characters. Things happen for seemingly no reason, and this leads me to another thing that happened for no reason or explanation, is that apparently Luke's lightsaber, which was previously Anakin Skywalker's lightsaber before turning into Darth Vader, the lightsaber from The Empire Strikes Back is apparently found and someone has it, and apparently is sort of in that cantina type scene like was stolen from A New Hope, back in that cantina scene with all the aliens and stuff and the music playing. Someone has this lightsaber sitting in their basement that happens to be Luke's, and Rey, the main protagonist, so to speak, ends up finding it in this crate and touches it, and then suddenly a bunch of new memories come through. They're just way, way, way out of left field for, I don't know how they come about. I mean, apparently she didn't know that stuff before. I mean, I don't know. I mean, she must be a Jedi, right? I mean, if she's getting all these visions and stuff about stuff that apparently she doesn't remember, but she suddenly does remember because she's touching a lightsaber. But it just happens for no reason, for one, for the visions that happen. And then the reason that the lightsaber was there is just not explained. The character that has that in their possession states in the movie that's a story for another time. I wouldn't be able to explain it in 15 seconds how I came about this lightsaber. The scriptwriter that wrote this line clearly didn't know what he was thinking when he put that lightsaber there in that little, spot. It does not make any sense. I mean, we all saw what happened to Luke's lightsaber. He got his hand cut off by Darth Vader in that first confrontation in The Empire Strikes Back. Then the hand falls down with the lightsaber or whatever, and it falls down out of Cloud City into oblivion. If Luke actually intended on getting that lightsaber back, he wouldn't have constructed his own for episode 6, where, clearly he's using a green one instead of the blue one, right? And it also has a bit of a different sort of, hilt, handle, or whatever, if you look at it a bit more. But it does not make any sense. I mean, clearly, I don't think any lightsaber could survive that big of a fall. I don't care how well it's constructed. it would probably just burst. I mean, if the Death Star can destroy planets and everything that's known to man on that planet, then I do not think that a lightsaber that's going at such speed going down to the surface would be able to survive that fall. Nor would anyone would be able to even find it reasonably. So there's lots of things that do not make sense. Obviously that lightsaber existing in the first place is just one big contradiction after another. And the fact that someone could use that lightsaber with no training whatsoever and defeat a Dark Jedi is just ludicrous. There were some good things in this movie, but they're just so few and far in between. It's really hard for me to like this movie at all. And is even the music. The music was not memorable at all. It is not something that you would want to just go out and buy the CD for because you liked it that much. There's only one theme that kind of played that really caught my attention. I think it was Ray's theme, but I'm gonna have to go back and look and maybe check just to make sure which one it was. But it was not very memorable at all. I mean, at first when I was watching this movie, outside of the usual, Star Wars themes that came from the original movies, I would have almost wagered that this score wasn't actually composed by John Williams. I mean, apparently he did compose the music, but it is not sort of the classical vibe, the memorable vibe, where you had that Star Wars feeling. You just knew it was Star Wars music the moment that you listened to it. You could resonate with a certain scene from a movie that you hear it. It just wasn't there. You didn't even, I mean, I couldn't even tell you much about the music outside of just that one, I think, Ray theme, I think it was. Again, I'll have to look back on it to see, how it sounded, but there was nothing really that memorable about the movie in general other than what I thought was bad about it. And the special effects obviously are pretty nice, but so much of it is just CGI. It doesn't have the same magic that the originals had. Back in the 80s, they really had to push that technology to get the results that they wanted, especially for the original where the budget was only around like 10 to 15 million, which even at the time wasn't exactly a AAA budget. And so there wasn't any originality. They played it so safe that they could make a lot of money off of it for this movie. But for fans like me, it will end up turning them off because it will not be something that we want to go see more of if they're not going to be taking chances and wanting to be original. Also, a bit conveniently, the Finn character seems to have gone through brainwashing methods. It's mentioned in the movie that a lot of these stormtroopers they're not necessarily clone troops anymore like they were for a lot of the previous sort of regimes where you had the Clone Wars and all the clones there and the clone army, and then during the Galactic Empire with Emperor Palpatine and Darth Vader, you had a lot of these stormtroopers back then which were probably still clones, at least a number of them were. And I hear that they had volunteers and such that were also there, which is why some of them sounded different in the films or looked different, or why Han and Luke being different wouldn't really seem like so far-fetched and such like that when they're on the Death Star. But in all the previous films, you could basically just say that the stormtroopers in the original trilogy were loyal, and you never had a case of anyone defecting except when it came to Imperial officers, one of which being Crix Madine, who we see in Episode 6. However, in this movie, what ends up happening is that it's revealed by the sort of leading commander of the sort of First Order, which is basically the Imperials, but the commander of those forces is brainwashing and sort of conditioning people from the start to believe that the rebels are kind of they're evil, they're bad, or something along those lines to get them to believe that the First Order is in actuality better than sort of the New Republic, the rebels, the resistance, or whatever you want to call them. Apparently they're supposed to be better. They're brainwashing them, and the commander claims that hey, my brainwashing techniques, they're perfect, they're infallible. You will not have to worry about them obeying my orders or being able to carry out our mission. They're the perfect troops. My methods are perfect. I cannot be wrong, and ends up biting them in the ass, apparently, in this movie, because Finn ends up sort of defecting. He realizes the error of his ways. I mean, it's not really explained how that happens, except for the fact that he's like, well, it's the right thing to do, even though he turns right back around and goes from shooting like innocent civilians and stuff as a stormtrooper and working for the First Order, and then turns right back around into sort of kind of violence, against stormtroopers and the First Order, and flying as part of a Tie Fighter, and operating a turret and shooting them. You're like, yeah, we're getting them now, and it's kind of being the opposite of what you'd think. Someone who's like, oh, I'm trying to do the right thing. I don't want to kill people anymore. War is bad. I don't want to be the bad guy. I just don't want to hurt people anymore. And he goes right around and does stuff like that, where he's just shooting up stormtroopers, and he's kind of happy about it, that he's doing the right thing. It's kind of like the sense of morality and how he comes to that conclusion, even after supposedly being brainwashed. I mean, it doesn't make sense with that. The fact that he turns his back on his own sort of self-imposed moral compass doesn't make much sense either. And it, again, it bites the Empire in the ass plot-wise, because, I mean, hey, it has to happen in order for things to progress the way that J.J. Abrams wanted it to. It just seems like it was kind of a cheap sort of way for J.J. Abrams to take on the defector sort of character without them having the same sort of background that, say, Crix Maydeen did, and he was an Imperial officer likely for at least a few years. I can't remember much about the expanded universe to remember him specifically, but I do know that he had an extensive amount of knowledge, at least in terms of troops and that sort of thing. He was kind of like, an officer. He could be a general for the rebels, and he could know the relevant information to help them directly. There were no ifs, ands, or buts. He had a lot of useful information, which is why him defecting was very important for them, and in terms of Episode 6, very important for that as well. But Finn, he was a janitor. That's what he tells everyone. He was a janitor originally on the sort of new Death Star, the Star Killer base weapon that pops up in the movie. And that's not a very important position, but yet he still has enough knowledge somehow with that to sort of give the rebels, the resistance, key information, help take the weapon down, or to try and destroy it, or get past these defenses and stuff. The only relevant information that he says in the movie that makes much sense for it, given his position and background, is the stormtrooper helmet not being able to filter out certain kinds of toxins when Rey and Finn, first stumble on the Millennium Falcon, and then Han and Chewie, come in, and stuff like that. And anyone who's watched the movie know that that's the scene where we first get sort of introduced to Han and Chewie, and it's by surprise and all that stuff. But just didn't want to get too off track on another tangent there. So, which leads me to another thing that J.J. Abrams and company decided to go ahead and end up doing, was with Captain Phasma, which is like the lead stormtrooper, the highest ranking, stormtrooper. Maybe it's just the highest ranking foot soldier. But in the movie, they kind of portrayed and kind of, leading us to believe that they're, a really important person, and that they are going to play some, big role somewhere in the movie, and that they're not going to be more than, they're not going to be a glorified pawn, like a lot of the stormtroopers are. And, Finn, he's a stormtrooper, and he ends up defecting, and he becomes an important character. But generally, most stormtroopers is kind of there for, like, cannon fodder, or what you would basically expect to happen to sort of those no-name characters. It's kind of, Galaxy Quest ended up parodying that kind of thing, kind of, in that film a little bit. But this Captain Phasma is something of a different kind of stormtrooper, and it was led us to believe that they're going to be different. They're going to be a badass, maybe kind of like Kylo Ren is supposed to be, or at least what the filmmakers want us to believe. And they don't get much screen time. Captain Phasma, they actually looked more reminiscent of what I would feel would be like the first Dark Trooper from the sort of Dark Trooper project in the expanded universe. And Dark Troopers are featured in several of the video games I played of Star Wars. I believe that they're in the Dark Forces, Star Wars Dark Forces, and then they're in Star Wars Galactic Battlegrounds and Star Wars Battlefront 2, or maybe the first game as well. I can't remember. But I mean, they're in a few video games, and she kind of looked like she'd be one. She's got that sort of gray coloring of the suit, and it kind of looks like, maybe she just, put a jetpack on there, and she could just become kind of like the first Dark Trooper, and then down the line they could eventually end up maybe engineering more of them, so they don't have to have, robotic kind of built Dark Troopers. They can engineer people to go ahead and become Dark Troopers that aren't Force sensitive. They're not going to be a Dark Jedi, but they need like super troops to go ahead and help them out in the battlefield and take care of those resistance members and those rebels that always seem to get the upper hand on them. So instead of developing like super weapons like they did in the previous films, you kind of expect maybe that they might try a different tactic of super soldiers instead of super weapons that can easily be destroyed if the circumstances are right. Because killing a whole bunch of troopers that are spread out across the galaxy would probably be a bit harder to destroy unless you had something like, say, the Jedi Academy that Luke is supposed to have had at one point, and that's referenced in the film. If you had a bunch of Jedi, you would probably be able to take on Dark Troopers to some degree, or super soldiers and those kinds of things that have more than just conventional weapons and training, and that they don't get shot down so easily. Um, Unfortunately, what my hopes might have been going for are not actually what happened in the movie, and far from it, because Captain Phasma ended up not really getting much screen time at all. We see her mostly in sort of the background and scenes when we do see her, and she sounded kind of cool. She looked kind of cool the brief moments that we got to see her, and then at the very moment that she becomes so relevant to the plot, she ends up turning her back on the First Order that she's sort of sworn to serve, sworn to protect, sworn to, obey her orders, do right by Kylo Ren and, the First Order and, all these other people that are in command. It just makes no sense to me why they would just go ahead and betray the people that they basically sworn like an oath to, and they're led to believe like from birth or from the moment that they get snatched up to be trained as a trooper that just the resistance is bad. You don't want to have anything to do with them. You want to just go ahead and shoot them on sight or take them prisoner. Just do whatever you want. Just don't ever support them. And what does she do? Well, after Han, Chewie, and Finn find a way to go ahead and bypass the sort of energy shield covering the planet like Episode 6 did with the Death Star to try and protect their super weapon in this movie, essentially. Han and company decide to go and find a way to hyperspace through the shield. Then once they get in, they somehow encounter this Captain Phasma, and I could live with that if it was better explained how the characters even got to that point of suddenly finding Captain Phasma, and what reasons would Phasma have to deactivate the shield, which is protecting something that is very, very important that can destroy multiple planets at a time, and thinking that, oh, this could not go horribly wrong. My life is more important than our super weapon, even though they could end up killing me anyway, no matter what I do. Like, she doesn't just spit in the face of her adversaries for some reason. Well, I'm just going to bend over backwards. I'm going to let these guys go ahead and have an opportunity to just, blow up our establishment. Which is a shame, because from when I watched the beginning of the movie, I kind of, I almost had the weird hunch that she might become the best character. I mean, she might have been my favorite, but not only did she not get any screen time, she just wasn't handled well. And when she finally had a chance to be relevant and show her stuff, strut her badassery, she just kind of, becomes nothing. She gets ripped down into just a little, another stormtrooper that just isn't, higher rank, has a different set of armor, and is a woman. I mean, that's essentially what happens. She gets degraded down into just another little stormtrooper that doesn't really mean all that much, and she doesn't get very much dialogue, no screen time, like I said. And then when she finally becomes relevant, she just acts completely out of character for what I would have thought, and for what was just implied throughout the entire movie by the people that are training up these troopers. Apparently, they think that they can just keep them in order, and they can't. And, it bit him in the butt with Finn, and it bit him in the butt with Captain Phasma, who apparently thought that betraying her superiors and betraying her sort of, whole side, she endangered a lot of people just to try and save herself. And even then she gets dumped into the garbage bin by Han and everyone, which makes a cheap ode to Episode 4 when they go ahead and are on the Death Star, and, they find a way to escape from that prison level going through to the garbage chute. It was just kind of a cheap little ode that they just put in there, apparently, just to try and appease people. And they needed something to do with Captain Phasma to get him out of the picture, because, I mean, they're not going to just stand there lightly, I would hope anyway, and just, take it. I mean, I would have expected them to stand up to them and not tell them anything, and to not give them an inch, and not to, endanger their big old space weapons station. I think it's called Star Killer Base or something like that, the Star Killer Weapon or something like that. I don't even remember. I was just looking on the IMDb page real quick just to see the names of stuff and figure it out. But Some of it's just hard to remember just from watching the movie one time. And honestly, I'd rather not go to the theater to see it again another time. What else? There was also that one scene on the little ship, maybe not the little ship, but the sort of cargo ship that Han and Chewie apparently have, where they're transporting some kind of animal. Geez, I already forget what they were, but they were kind of trying to get some of these animals, these little, feisty animals, and apparently they were trying to go and smuggle them for some people, and they had like a down payment on it. And then apparently, just out of nowhere, we get these sort of guys are coming after Han to collect their debt or to collect their 50,000 credits or whatever he borrowed for the mission. And then he gets another set of smuggler people that come after him as well. And then, these monsters that they were transporting are just unleashed. Unleashed or unsheathed, and they are let out of their cage, and they go around killing basically everybody on the ship. All the people that are trying to hunt down and grab Han and Chewie and sell them off for bounty or something, and they all just get smacked down like a bunch of stormtroopers. I mean, we see them for a brief moment. They have these weird kind of cheesy kind of hairstyles from that you see from like 80s cheesy movies or something like that. And it's just kind of, it would seem in line with Star Wars, but they would just like they just get killed like almost immediately, after these things come out, and just the main characters are just able to survive by pure coincidence or pure strokes of luck, which admittedly did happen a few times in the original movies, but you can only have it go so far, and when you're trying to copy A New Hope all the time, it just it doesn't really work out the same way if you try and do it over and over and over again, where the bad guys are always the ones that are apparently dying, and then the good guys are just sort of getting away with it after all these years. They just keep getting away with, all these monsters are apparently killing these other guys that are after them, but they just can't get, they can't kill Rey, they can't kill Finn, they can't kill Han, they can't capture Chewie or take him away or kill him. It's just kind of uninteresting to me. And the animals that they used, or the beasts that they used, could have been a lot better as well. They could have been, I don't know, I mean, they were kind of original, maybe not so much to me personally, but maybe that's what they were hoping that they were going for by not having, like, say, a Rancor that's growing up or something like that on there, Rancors, baby Rancors, Rancors that need to feed, Womp Rats, all the stuff that you would have heard about in the previous movies or maybe seen at some point in one of the expanded universe titles, like, video games, books, whatever. I was hoping for something a bit different that would, it would mean something. Killing the Rancor in episode 6 when Luke was able to kill it, it was difficult, it was hard, and in this movie, it just means nothing to encounter these creatures because you don't have to kill them. You just have to, you have to be the fastest to get away so you don't get chomped down. I mean, that's basically what it amounts to. And then they just sort of escape in the Falcon as like a get out of jail free card. And I don't know how that just suddenly just happens. I mean, it just happens to be that they can get away from these guys and the creatures that are just chowing down on them. And then it just seems like a cheap getaway to me. I don't know. Maybe it's just me, but even if it was entertaining and the special effects and all that, I think I preferred the monsters and the aliens and that kind of stuff from the original movies a lot better. At least episodes 4, 5, and 6. And now to move on to like a few of the other gripes, I guess, is that one of them is that in one of the scenes of the movie, it has like a well, not exactly one scene, but in the later portions of the movie, you have the big old, Death Star-like weapon, and anyone who's seen the movie will know that it's basically like a Death Star, which they claim is like a bunch more powerful than any regular Death Star could ever be. However, there are a few big problems I have with it, namely the fact that, like the original Death Star, how could you leave it with such a huge weakness and not protect it at all costs? We're talking about a super powerful mega weapon of mass destruction that could destroy multiple planets at the same time, and you do not bother to protect it with every damn thing that you have at your disposal. Why would you not do that? I mean, didn't they learn their lesson from being overconfident in episode 6, where you had a big protective shield and the Emperor just got so overconfident about being able to defend the shield generator of troops that they just ended up losing the whole damn thing? I mean, you think that they just would have learned their lesson after losing a Death Star, something as powerful as the Death Star that could destroy planets in a single stroke. on two different occasions that they would have done everything in their power to protect something so gigantic in terms of destruction power, something that could destroy practically anything. I mean, it's just one big damn MacGuffin to where they just wanted to make something where, hey, it has to be destroyable, otherwise the Rebel Alliance is basically finished, because every single planet that supports them, or the sort of resistance, I mean, I just want to call them the Rebels for what they are. But essentially, were it not destroyable, then the Rebels would basically be finished. Every planet that supports the rebels would essentially just be blown up before the rebels had a chance to react or to repel that kind of firepower with their own ships, which, they're just not very many of them apparently, but it would have been a long, hard road had they not been able to destroy it in the way that they were. Which really just makes it a badly written part of the movie. But the importance of such a weapon cannot be overstated, no matter how ridiculous it might seem, scientifically speaking, or just in terms of plot-wise, how it seems like they wouldn't really seem plausible, or really, given the First Order's resources, or even strategically sound to go that direction instead of something else. But with how they're so easily able to destroy planets that support the Resistance, you would think that it would be so vitally important that they would have as many things as possible defending it. Like, anti-air missile at walkers, or, something that could just bring down anything that the resistance could end up throwing up against it to try and destroy it, regardless if they have a shield there or not. I mean, Captain Phasma basically defeated their whole plan by just being the one person that lowered down the shield, which, again, it just doesn't make all that much sense individually and in the grand scheme. So take that for what you will. On the other hand, the idea of super soldiers, or those dark troopers that I mentioned earlier in the video with Captain Phasma and talking about her, would have made more sense to me, mainly because building all these super, ships, or these super sort of weapons, and how easily they can be destroyed, it also means that every time that they use that weapon, they're destroying planets that you won't be able to get back in the universe. They support the resistance now, but if you conquer them, you can utilize all of those resources instead of just blowing everything up. Like Alderaan, the Empire won't be able to get it back, so they can conquer it for themselves and use all the resources and all the planets, stuff that they have there, all of the, housing, farming, or any kinds of infrastructure or industry that they could use on these planets. You can't get it back once you destroy a planet. You can't simply rebuild a planet. When you destroy everything in a system, you're leaving nothing there for yourself and whatever you might be able to get back from it if you just conquered it. If you use soldiers, if you used, Dark Jedi to go in there and lead soldiers to take the planet over, that would make a lot more sense to sort of plunder and conquer than to just outright destroy everything. I mean, Alderaan was destroyed for, trying to convince Princess Leia to give them a key piece of information. It wasn't destroyed to try and keep that planet out of the hands of the rebels, or destroying it just for the heck of it. I mean, it was a show of power, but it was one that was clearly demonstrated, and they only had to destroy one planet that wasn't necessary to destroy, and they did it so that way they could get their message across and do it very, very well, and in front of Leia at the time. The Empire had done that instead of doing what the First Order is doing in Episode 7, which is destroying an entire system for little reason other than they support the Resistance. And conquering those planets instead of destroying them must be much too much effort for their stormtroopers, and the stormtroopers which still can't seem to hit anything, granted, but it seems like it would have been a much better idea to not blow everything up. I mean, eventually you're not going to have any planets left to blow up if you just keep on doing it again and again and again, because you can't get planets back. It's just impossible to do that. And I guess I find it odd that the rebels weren't able to utilize any sort of capital ships. I mean, they were able to do that at the end of Return of the Jedi to try and help destroy the Death Star. And it just seemed really odd to me how they didn't utilize any capital ships in this movie. I did not see not one Rebel Alliance capital ship in the entire movie. No Corellian corvettes, no Nebulon B frigates, no Mon Calamari cruisers, none of the stuff that you saw in Episode 6. Apparently none of the ships in that movie, other than the fighters, survived. None of those cruisers survived. There's a Mon Calamari that shows up in the movie as sort of a commander type. It's possible that was Admiral Akbar that they showed, but the movie was moving so fast, so it's hard for me to take in some of the characters' names. But they have no capital ships left over whatsoever to be able to deal with any firepower from the First Order, which is what the Imperials are now in this movie. So basically, what the Rebel Alliance relies on is basically the same thing that they relied on in Episode 4 for the most part, which is the X-Wings and the fighters to go ahead and, the one-man fighter destroying a big old space station and, blowing it to bits that could destroy planets, but they just didn't, compensate for the fact that a one-man fighter might be able to deal damage to them. But, at least then it was explained, how they were able to, get the Death Star plans and how they were able to go ahead and find a weakness that was something that they probably just overlooked. I mean, it's reasonable that there's a trench there because it's for an exhaust port, right? So they have to be able to get all the heat out of there for all the operating systems and stuff. I mean, it's a big space station. Obviously, it's prone to overheating, like any technology is. And they at least explained in that movie the fact that in order to destroy it, you had to shoot a proton torpedo in there because a ray shield would block the laser blasts and any normal weapons and stuff. So you would only be able to get a one-man fighter in there to go ahead and blow this thing up and cause that chain reaction. I mean, at least they explained it, and there was build up, and it was at the very end of the movie. It was not predictable. It was not predictable what happened at the end with the Millennium Falcon coming out of nowhere to help Luke destroy the Death Star and help him out and all that. I mean, it was unpredictable. You didn't know what was going to happen for the most part. You didn't know that Luke was going to go ahead and, turn off his little targeting computer and use the Force to try and, find the right sweet spot to get that, to shoot that torpedo in there and blow that thing up. You didn't know what was going to happen. There was no suspense in this. There was no suspense at all in Episode 7. You kind of knew what was going to happen after you found out that it was building up to be the same thing that Episode 4 did throughout most of the movie, and just replacing a few characters here and there, and then also just kind of adding a few new lines here and there. Like Han Solo at one point says, "Well, that's not how the Force works, buddy." That's basically what he says. It's like the Force doesn't work like that. It doesn't just. It's not just a major convenience that will just work when you want it to, or it'll solve all of the issues that we're facing, or whatever. Which was kind of interesting because Han is trying to Harrison Ford was doing his best with what he was given. He's a great actor, but in this movie, he was just limited by the script, and the Death Star was just it was not it was not a good idea for this movie. You needed to wait and build it up to the second and third movies of this new trilogy before you had the super weapon come about. I mean, it's a glorified Death Star that draws off the power of a sun. When you do that, and you imply that by drawing this power from the sun, that suddenly it's going to go ahead and destroy the sun or draw all of its energy and just suck it dry. It will no longer be a sun. It will just kind of, it will cease to be the way it is. Did J.J. Abrams or the scriptwriters not think this through before figuring out what they were going to do with this super weapon? I mean, we all know that basic science, even in the real world and not this fictional one, dictates that if you do crap with the sun, you're going to affect every single planet in the solar system, even if you're not blowing them up with this super weapon. You will essentially be killing yourselves or killing your infrastructure at least, by draining the sun's power. Because I mean, everything's going to just turn into like an ice age, and if you flat out destroy the sun and drain it of anything that makes it what it is. I mean, I'm not sure if they actually would destroy it or not, if it just drains all the energy and makes it basically a barren type, soulless piece of metal or whatever. Whatever the case, if they destroyed the sun completely, not only would that affect, the revolving around the sun and, the gravitational pull of the planets and all that stuff, it would just screw everything up in that solar system without a second thought. It wouldn't even happen it wouldn't happen overnight, but it would certainly be a big factor in the future movies that if you were to make such a sacrifice, clearly you better think through the risks if you're the Empire, because you'd basically be screwing up that entire solar system. So if you have a lot of support on those planets, or a big amount of your, war machine that's coming from that system, it would not be the best idea to have your super weapon, which can apparently shoot anywhere at at any time. It can shoot anywhere at any time and hit multiple planets with its super weapon. It does not make sense at all. Not only that, but being able to hit multiple planets at the same time and blow them up. In the original movie, it was used out of fear. It was a fear tactic to keep everyone in line. It wasn't to try and show the rebels that you were not powerful enough to defeat them. It was to try and keep every system in line. That's the reason why the Death Star was built. The Death Star was built as a fear tactic by Grand Moff Tarkin because he wanted to keep everyone in line after dissolving the Old Republic. It was the one way to keep them from just breaking off and doing their own thing or revolting against them, because there was the fear that they could be blown up. Not that, oh, well, clearly, they'll just blow us up eventually, so, woe is me. It wasn't like that at all, at least originally. Now, it was before everything happened in that movie the way it did. They eventually did blow up a planet, but that was after after the plot developed and all that. Here, however, the plot didn't actually develop in such a meaningful way to make it make sense. And obviously, when they try and make a dramatic moment out of this weapon firing, that people in different solar systems or in a different system than the planets that are being targeted can apparently see what's happening as it happens. You wouldn't be able to spot that. Basic science again dictates that the speed of light must travel, and these events that are happening must travel to reach your vision to actually see what's unfolding. If you can't spot it, then you can't see it, because the speed of light, the speed of sound, it all has to travel. It all has a speed, and if it travels through the galaxy fast enough, then you might be able to see it. But that would have to be in the same galaxy, and they were like 2 or 3 galaxies away or something like that when it happened. At least to my knowledge. I mean, the way I'm understanding from watching the movie, I might have to watch it again on DVD or something like that to be able to get everything. But to my understanding, they were at least a system, a galaxy away, and light traveled fast enough for them to see all this as it was happening for dramatic effect, which it does not make sense at all that it would be able to happen that way. I mean, again, if everything else about the movie were good, if it were all good, if it all made sense, if it just had coherence and the continuity was there, everything that we would hope that we would get out of this movie was there, it wouldn't be a big deal for this one thing. But it all adds up, and just becomes a clusterfuck of trying to understand how all these things happened, all in the same movie, and they tried to fit so many things in that they just went through a linear path. They went through a linear path of the story, and it didn't make sense as a result of it. Alright, now what else? Well, apparently there's a new pilot sort of character called Poe Dameron, which is just kind of a cheap way to go ahead and have, hey, Luke kind of character as the top pilot. He goes and destroys the Death Star super weapon at the end of the movie. He's kind of like the replacement for Wedge from the original trilogy, because apparently Wedge's actor didn't want to be doing the same thing over and over again, sitting in like a cockpit for most of the movie, which is understandable because that's kind of what Poe actually does. A majority of the movie is him spent doing that. He's in a cockpit a lot of the time, and it's just, they could have basically rolled his character in with someone else, with like the Finn character, and they could have been basically the same guy, and they could have just eliminated one of them, and they would have cut some of the plot holes or some of the sort of errors, story errors, not really, or maybe not errors, but things that certainly didn't make sense to me. Maybe not factually, but maybe just kind of highly improbable or unlikely. And they would have cut their losses. They would have just cut down some of these unnecessary characters and stopped trying to replace old ones with new ones to try and take their role or their place. And again, it's copying off of episode 4 a lot. They do a lot of things that are much similar to that, and they add a droid here to replace this one, or they add this device here to replace that one. They have a cameo with Max von Sydow at the beginning of the movie, which which is no connection really to, I mean, at least to my knowledge, the previous movies. Maybe he has a connection to some of the characters in this movie or what happens, but It would have to be explained in episode 8 to understand what he was doing there and what his cameo was, what his role was, because nothing is explained prior to his appearance. Absolutely nothing goes on in the movie that indicates really who he is, what his purpose is, and why he's, saying the things the way he is. I mean, there's no real foreshadowing as to what people's role is for people like him. There's no sort of hints that maybe someone will be at least slightly important as a side character, like Lando Calrissian. Was he wasn't even in the first movie, but he ends up being a side character and he ends up being important. The Mon Calamari end up being important in the episode 6. And there's different sorts of characters or aliens that kind of play a role somewhere, like the Jawas in episode 4. In this movie, there's no real new interesting aliens. They're all just kind of, hogwash. It'd be much better just watching, Mass Effect or playing Mass Effect and seeing the aliens from that. They are much more original than episode 7, especially that cantina scene where there's just wholly unoriginal kinds of aliens. I mean, they're not bad, but they are unoriginal at best. So that's the way I'm going to say it for that one. But there's a lot of work that could have been done on this movie to make it better. I mean, they even have cameos by like C3PO and R2D2. They hardly appear at all in the movie. They don't really serve much of a purpose except at the very end where R2 comes out of this sort of sleep mode that he has because Luke ran off and that was like his owner. And so he must have been like a depressed droid or something with his programming or something where he just suddenly wakes up at the end to be a MacGuffin and complete this little map that's supposed to find Luke. And it comes out of nowhere that he has access to this big old map, and apparently it only takes one piece, maybe a few systems in the galaxy that apparently just it makes it so easy to find him that, apparently it's so easy to find him just having one small piece of a bigger map that they can find him at the end of the movie, which, yes, it does happen. They do find Luke, or at least Rey does. I mean, apparently she knows where to find him somehow, in some way. I mean, maybe she's force sensitive, like is hinted at in the entire movie, and she just can sense his presence on this particular planet. I mean, it's never explicitly stated what's going on. There's nothing explained. And Mark Hamill as Luke Skywalker shows up for like a minute of screen time, a cameo at most at the end of the movie, but he's a big character, but he doesn't appear until the very end of the movie. Yeah, and then he gets shown his old lightsaber, which somehow just reappears and it somehow exists even after being thrown from Cloud City. I mean, I imagine his surprise as a character to be like, "What the heck is my lightsaber doing here? I thought the thing was long gone." Oh man. Oh well, there were quite a few things wrong with this movie, and I could go on and on forever about the plot holes, things that made absolutely no sense, about how the characters are bad, about how Kylo Ren is just basically an emo Sith that has an impractical lightsaber design, and it would be much. I mean, Darth Maul at least made sense. I mean, he's more of a badass than Kylo Ren could ever hope to be. I mean, at least one would think. I mean, a dual-bladed lightsaber, horns on his head. He goes up against two Jedi at once, and he even kills one of them. And it just, it made no sense to have him be the way he was. I mean, apparently he's struggling like Darth Vader was in Episode 6, where he's kind of like between good and bad, and light side and dark side. But he's supposed to be the main antagonist, and what you have is a weak antagonist, just with the way he's portrayed in the film, the script, revealing his sort of face and his identity too early. It had no build up. There was no build up that way that they did it with episode 4, 5, and 6. They tried cramming so many things into one movie for episode 7 to try and do what the original trilogy did over 3 movies, which is like 6 to 7 hours of screen time, and fit it into like a 2.5 hour movie, while copying off of episode 4 by itself. So it was basically a cluster of things that just happened for no reason and made no sense. And a small spoiler alert for the game Knights of the Old Republic if you haven't played it yet. Even the idea of connecting these two maps together, or pieces of a map together, to try and find Luke or wherever the heck he went, it seems like a blatant sort of copy off of the star maps of Knights of the Old Republic, which play a huge part in the plot and seems kind of similar to how the structure works of trying to have to find these maps. These are so important. They'll find what we need to go ahead and, for the end of the story and all that stuff. Just kind of a big unnecessary copy of other material, just like the much of the movie is for some reason. So, that's the bottom line of it. Again, even the music wasn't exactly that memorable either, like I mentioned. There were a number of, continuity errors. There was things that were impractical and highly improbable. There was a series of just big coincidences, like the droid appearing with, battle plans or, just in the original movie series, it was episode 4. You had R2D2 with the Death Star plans. Episode 7 comes around. They're trying to find a map to find Luke, who just, went into exile, kind of like Yoda did, for some reason, being depressed that his, new Jedi Order was just being killed off by apparently a Sith apprentice, which wasn't even fully trained. I have no idea how that happened, but apparently it did, according to Disney. According to Disney, it happened. So, now one thing that people might try and bring up as sort of a counter argument to one of the things that people don't understand very much, at least right now. Another quick spoiler alert for Knights of the Old Republic, I know, second time, since that's going to come up here in a short bit, is the character of Rey, and how exactly does she know how to use these force powers with no training whatsoever? How does she know how to use a lightsaber? How are these memories suddenly triggered by touching lightsaber, and her obviously being force sensitive in some way? How does all this happen? Is her powers just suddenly awakened because came in contact with something that triggered memories and sort of internalized, force sensitivity and all these abilities that maybe she learned in the past, but it was kept, sort of like a secret from her, from maybe Luke. Maybe Luke trained her. Maybe someone from the Jedi Order, maybe Max von Sydow's character trained her at some point in time, and they just found a way to contain her powers and to contain her memories of what happened to try and keep her safe from the First Order or whatever. Maybe just Luke and Leia and Han, were trying to do something to protect her and to protect her from Kylo Ren and, the Sith that are trying to take back the galaxy because, revealing that someone is force sensitive is just like a kiss of death apparently in this universe unless you're a Jedi Knight already. However, that would already be a plot device, and slight spoiler alert in case you haven't played it. Knights of the Old Republic had a plot device much similar to something like what might be implied by what happens to Rey in this movie. I do not want to go into detail because if you want to play that game for yourself, then obviously that would be more enjoyable than me spoiling it in a review about a movie which I am not really a fan of right now. But I will say this. If in fact what they might be getting at is Rey had her powers sort of hidden or contained intentionally by the Jedi that trained her to keep her safe from the First Order and from the Sith, protecting her from herself, of Jedi lineage and all that. If they did that, it would basically be doing something almost much similar and copying off Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic, the video game. Copying off just yet another big plot device of Knights of the Old Republic, just like with the maps trying to find Luke is like a copy of the star maps used to go ahead and find the Star Forge in Knights of the Old Republic. Just the way that, you have these things in Knights of the Old Republic with a big, plot twist and all this stuff with these kinds of surprises, if you will, things that you don't see coming, kind of like in some of the original movies, like, with Darth Vader being Luke's father and things like that. That's just it. It's not original either if that's what they're going for. It's already been done before in the Star Wars universe, and, it's not original anymore. It's not something that you can be like, oh man, that was such a fancy, plot device, it's such a plot twist, we're going to do everything that we want. No, it's not there. It's not original, and you're not going to fool anybody, at least people that pay attention to what happens outside of just the movies. You have to think about what you're doing. Get a script writer, then you get a script editor to clean things up that actually knows about everything that there is to know about Star Wars. If you're a massively bloated budget, get someone to look at that with all of their knowledge. the sort of, scholar, if you will, maybe even two scholars or three, who knows. Get them to look at it, and then get someone that's like an assistant director to tell J.J. Abrams when he's wrong. Get someone to tell him when he's screwed up, when it's not right, when something isn't right about the film. If the dialogue is, just clunky, or if it's just not working, if a scene is just not flowing very well. They needed people to just call them out. To call them out on, while they were working on this stuff, to say, this doesn't make sense at all. Even scientifically speaking, this should be an impossibility. Hyperspace from inside of a capital ship that is holding you there with the Millennium Falcon. You should not be able to go ahead and go out of hyperspace from inside of a capital ship because you have to input a coordinates into the nav computer. The nav computer would probably never even let you enter hyperspace to be able to properly compute all that stuff. Han even goes through this in episode 4 a few times with, like Luke. You cannot go into hyperspace without going through the nav computer and taking a few moments to input the coordinates. How would you be able to hyperspace out of a capital ship and not get, it just does not make any sense. And being able to go in hyperspace towards directly into a planet and somehow stop at sublight, like even sublight speed. How would you stop that fast? How would you be able to calculate it just correctly to where you could use hyperspace to try and enter a planet's atmosphere to bypass some shield or something? How would you be able to do that correctly without having like Jedi reflexes or something like that, like with the pod races or something? How would you even be able to do that if you'd never done it before or tested it? I mean, it makes no sense. Han in episode 4, if you go ahead and input nav computer so that way you don't run through a supernova or an asteroid field, or if you run into some stray, black hole or, something like that. I mean, whatever happened to that? Whatever happened to, explaining things properly, staying with the in-universe explanations like the Mass Effect Codex, playing the Mass Effect series of games, which is also science fiction and, obviously draws a lot of inspiration from Star Wars and how they kept with their in-universe explanations of everything that they had in that series. Or at least in the first game. The other ones are a bit more questionable. But, it's kind of the same thing with Star Wars. They needed a codex to go and properly explain things, but you can only do that if you have like a video game or a book. With a movie, you have to explain everything in the movie, or give context for what's happening and why it's happening or how it came about, something, so that way it's not just like ending on one big cliffhanger and you're left with a bunch of questions and you want them answered, but the only way you're going to be able to do that is if you spend money on episode 8 and episode 9, and it's just I don't want to do that. I do not want to spend money just to find out what the heck happened in episode 8. It should have been explained in episode, 7, what could happen in episode 8 and episode 8 and episode 9. And, what happened in episode 7 should be explained what happened in episode 7 for the most part. And, hinted at in episode 6. Leia is supposed to be force sensitive, and apparently she's not using the force at all. She doesn't do jack diddly squat. Apparently Han had never used Chewie's bowcaster. I mean, it's what he says in the movie in episode 7. Apparently in all those years, he never bothered to use the bowcaster or use one in his life, in an emergency or in a, tight split where they're trying to, get away from people because he turns to smuggling again. I mean, you would think that he would have used it before in an emergency or, had trained with it or something. Not once. And, there's a reason why Wookiees use it, obviously, because, they're big weapons. They project a lot of force. That means a lot of recoil and all that. But you think he would have at least used it, kind of like the way he used the lightsaber in episode 5 at once. But, it's never explained. It just happens, and it happens. You have to believe Disney on their word on that, or J.J. Abrams, or the scriptwriter. It just is not a very coherent movie. You will not want to watch it if you are a film buff. You will not want to watch it if you are a die-hard Star Wars fan that knows things about the expanded universe that were so great. Jason and Jaina, the twins that were supposed to be Han and Leia's kids. I mean, that kind of stuff isn't here. Apparently in the expanded universe, Han and Leia had 3 kids. Luke had 1 kid. That kind of stuff is not present here, and if it is in this trilogy, it's going to have to be explained in the future movies, but that means spending more money. That would mean spending more money on the series that does not look very promising right now. If you are paying attention to the movie, you do not want to spend money on The Force Awakens. You do not want to give them your money because you will be supporting something that is not what you are looking for a Star Wars fan. For a sci-fi fan, you might get what you wanted. You might get something that's like a good popcorn flick, can be enjoyable. The special effects are good. You get your X-wings, you get stuff blowing up, you get kind of a lightsaber battle here and there. You get sort of somewhat fantasy elements. I mean, the Force powers aren't really used all that often, except for interrogation, and that's about it. Except at the end of the movie, where apparently Rey can use Force powers for no reason and no training. There's no real rhyme and reason to a lot of things that happen, and so there's not much reason that you would want to see this movie. Now, you might be able to still enjoy it if you don't go in with any expectations whatsoever, but if you're already a Star Wars fan and you want to see it that much, or if you haven't seen it already at this point, I would not recommend you go see it. At most, go to a friend's house and watch it when it comes out on DVD and Blu-ray. Just go to a friend's house and watch it, or borrow it, or something, and just watch it there. Formulate your own opinion after all the hype has died down and all the reviews are done, giving it raving reviews. It's a great classic. It's better than the prequels. It's on par with the original trilogy and all this stuff. It's everything that you would have wanted the original to be, but better. Well, it certainly copies a lot off the original, but it is not better in any way, shape, or form. The special effects in various spots are better, but I almost feel like the original had more charm to it. Even with the limited budget, the TIE fighters had more charm to it. In the space battles, there was more, build up. There was more meaning to what was going on, and it was just more fun. It was enjoyable. It was an adventure, too, in a way. And so it was all that you could have wanted in a good movie, despite the shortcomings. I mean, the original movies weren't perfect, but they were fun. They were engaging. They made you want to watch them. They made you want to watch the rest of them. If you're watching after the movies had already come out. I'm a 90s kid, so I grew up already knowing that there were 3 movies. So I went in already knowing that there's more to it. But yeah, that's just kind of just summing it up for me. I know it's kind of long-winded and such, and I apologize if it's really just kind of not cutting to the chase, but this is all just kind of mainly off of my memory. I did look up online here just to make sure I remember the characters' names, because, again, not all of them are very memorable, except for the actors that you might be able to recognize what their names are and, who they're playing, maybe. The actors you're probably going to remember much better than the characters themselves and their names and such. So that's my assessment. I just went through a lot of things I didn't like about it. I mean, there are a few things that I did like. I think I mentioned a few of them, but the music wasn't good. The continuity with the previous movies wasn't good. It completely just ditches the expanded universe, and it just cements what Disney said about the expanded universe, to where apparently it doesn't exist. It's all just for fun and entertainment, even though they took all of our money and from the license, being Star Wars. And it also it kind of undermines a lot of what happened in the original trilogy, which is the biggest offender in my mind, is that it undermined the original trilogy. Everything that happened, or most of the things that happened in Episode 6, have no meaning considering what happened in The Force Awakens. That's my point on it. You can watch the movie and see for yourself just how disappointing it is, how much it doesn't make sense. Just, word of caution, you may not like the movie if you are a big fan of Star Wars. If you are a sci-fi fan, you might get the enjoyment out of it that you want. If you want a popcorn flick, if you just want a popcorn flick and you don't care about the 3D or not, just go on and watch it if you want. But, you'd be better off just waiting until it comes out on the home video market, so to speak. Anyway, that's me, the Love Bat, and I went through just about everything there is, so hope that you all enjoyed my sort of assessment. Feel free to go and comment in the video comments if there's something else that you wanted to add. And also feel free to go ahead and correct me if there's something that I got wrong, or if I was in error at any spot. Then go ahead and feel free to comment on that as well if you would like. I am not afraid to admit that I might make a mistake here and there, because this is all going off of memory. And, I may not remember everything exactly as I thought that it was, and when I watched it or whatever. So mistakes might be made, but just feel free to comment on anything that you would like. Feel free to bring up anything else that you thought maybe you had an issue with, or maybe something that you liked about the movie, or if you disagreed with my assessment, feel free to go ahead and comment on that as well. I will love to hear opposing viewpoints. If you thought the movie was really good and want to explain why, then go ahead and let me know. If you thought that was better than the prequels and just as good as the original trilogy, fine. You can comment on that as you like as well. Just go ahead and explain your position. Just go ahead and explain it better than the way that the movie itself tried to explain things, which was not very good. Overall, I'd say if I had to give it like a numerical score, I'd probably give it like maybe a 5, maybe a decent 6 out of 10 for just a general sci-fi flick. If you're just watching it in the moment and you don't care about the story or what's happening, then you might be able to just, have a jolly good time with it. Maybe you might laugh at a few of the little jokes that go on here and there. Not many of them are good, granted, but you might get some enjoyment out of them. As a Star Wars film, however, I would have to give this a weak score, like maybe 3 out of 10 or something like that. I mean, it's very underwhelming on the story aspect, and things that you would expect them to not get wrong, they kind of do. And you expected something new out of this movie, you're not going to get what you want. So that's just my opinion on it. Anyway, thank you all for watching and listening to my long-winded assessment and being very critical of Star Wars The Force Awakens, and I'll see you all next time. Thanks for watching.